This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome to this session of Great Books of the Western World. So this is going to be a segmented portion of the second full book, which is a book of different plays from Greek history, basically. The first one we're going to start out with, so I say Aeschylus. How do you say it?
Yes, Aeschylus.
Okay.
Like the donkey is killing you. Aeschylus.
I see.
Sorry. All right.
So these plays all revolve around certain events in Greek history, and some of the history of Greece that we have is sort of drawn from these plays. And I think one of the interesting things about all of these is they cross, kind of like we saw with the Iliad, some degree to the Odyssey, but more the Iliad, how it's not just history, it was the way that the people understood history, because they had difficulty separating what was historically, I don't know how you'd say it, provable, confirmable. They had trouble separating that from the mythological perspective of it.
Right, or they didn't really worry about the distinction between the two as much as we would. Yeah.
Right. And they didn't care.
Right. Yeah, and and fair enough too, as far as I'm concerned, because it's not like we really know. If you go far back enough in history, we don't know what happened. Not really, not definitively.
Mm-hmm.
And so, at a certain point, mythology, you might say, has to take over history. Or in other words, I guess faith has to take over reason, because that's sort of the same type of thing. And if you look at the way we view, I guess the way a Christian would view the world, especially as some would call we fundamentalist Christians, at a certain point, the secular historical record closes and we go on to the biblical, which many people would say is the same, as the Greek mythologies. It's just another mythology, the story of Adam and Eve and that sort of thing. Now, even if we don't think that's true, it does still serve the same function. And that's an important point. So at a point, I think perhaps even you could say that at a point in real history, there was no distinction between, I guess, no distinction between mythology and history. In other words, God really acted on the world, and there really were men that we could call them giants or heroes, the time when giants walked the earth, if you will. That sort of thing actually happened, at least that's what many people believe. So and that's what we believe as Christians, so it's really no wonder that even for the Gentile peoples, at a certain point in their history back in the day, history and mythology wouldn't have been completely, at least not fully, distinguished from each other. So,
right, and I've tried to talk about this before whenever I teach things like why the Gospels, what we call the synoptic problem. One of the reasons why the synoptic problem and things like the Gospels not matching up chronologically and those sort of things is because that's not how they thought about history. That's not the way they recorded history. And that was true not only for their holy books, but that was true in general. They didn't take that as an important thing. They thought that meaning was more valuable than the actual chronological order and those sort of things. Whenever you've got a kind of just the facts type society like we have, we almost try to distance ourselves from meaning. We want to take away any abstraction of why things happen and stay to just the actual events, when they sort of did the opposite.
Right. Yes, that's true, that the significance was more important than the actual fact of the event, I suppose. And I think, though, that, not to get too off the topic, but that our current, I guess you might say, modern day view of history as opposed to mythology probably came about as a result of the life of Christ and the recording of the gospel. Because it seemed like really the first people in history that really started to care about what really happened, as opposed to what we like to say happened, were the Christians. Because it was Paul who talked about how, well, if Christ didn't actually die from the dead or rise from the dead, then we are of all men most miserable. So it seemed like to the Christians, they were the first people to really care about history as such. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the first real historians, beginning really in the early and middle medieval periods, they were all the scholastics. Um, they were the Catholic monks, priests. They were people that followed the Christ. So it was under that worldview that history actually became a distinguishable sign.
Yeah, and the thing is, or at least Judeo-Christians. I mean, one of the first historical books of any sort that tried to make an accurate log was the writings of Josephus, and that also, I think, comes down to maybe a respect for truth that wasn't there. But even he had some interpretations. He painted the Greeks in a pretty poor light, and after somebody offers a pig on your altar, I wouldn't be too happy about it either.
Right, and he also did include what we would call the different folklore of the Jews into his supposed history. So I guess you could say that even that type of writing wasn't completely divorced from the mythological aspect.
His is kind of mixed. I would say the later stuff that he was recording, like the War of the Jews part, that is fairly close to the actual events. Those have been confirmed outside. But whenever you get the history of the Jews, that's more, like you say, kind of a mixture of the two together. So getting on to some of these plays, we really, going into all of them in depth probably would just bore you, and we both were transparent the last time. These are not our favorites, but
I want to say though, I do want to say that I'm more interested in them than I thought I would be after actually reading them. I want to say, first of all, just on the outset, what's that?
I was going to say, did you move from like a 3 to a 4 or something?
No, I'd say I'm at a pretty good 7 now. It's actually pretty high, mostly because of the quality of the poetry. The quality of the English translation is really quite phenomenal. I don't know who did this translation. I didn't look to see the footnote, but whoever he was, he was actually a very great poet. Because it really takes a lot to be able to translate poetry from one language into another, and then to get it to rhyme in English.
Yeah, I was going to say, the fact that almost all of Agamemnon rhymes in English, which I was like, okay, whoever did this took some time and did a good job, and I commend them for that.
That or he butchered the original.
I haven't taken a look at it, but there's a good chance they did. But I will say, another part of this is we've kind of talked about some of these stories already, because the Odyssey and the Iliad kind of cover some of the same history. So that's one of the reasons why it's a little repetitive. We're going to save one of the ones that Aeschylus wrote for next week. So the story of Oedipus has kind of 3 phases to it, and the one that Aeschylus wrote kind of is in the middle between 2 works of Sophocles, which is Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex, you might have heard it called, and then Oedipus at, I'm going to completely butcher the location.
He was somewhere.
It starts with a C.
Starts with a C. Well, there's a start.
Colonus.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's the kind of end of his life, and the one that's here is about, I guess it's more about his 2 sons than it is actually about him, but we'll come back to that next week. We'll kind of cover that as one group of stories. So the 2 main ones I wanted to talk about are the Persians and then Prometheus Bound. So the first one I want to talk about is the Persians, because Luke and I have already discussed this. It's kind of an interesting piece of literature because of when it was written and what it was trying to accomplish. So one of the neat things about this play is it won an award at an Athens theater contest, for lack of a better term, in 472 BC. So even back then, they were already having competitions with what made a good story. And the story of the Persians is the story of the defeat of Xerxes at Athens. And that is, it's kind of told from an afterthought, mainly to Xerxes' mother, who was the queen, a former queen, however you want to look at that. But the interesting thing about it is the way that the Persians are described and the sympathy that's shown toward them.
Yes.
Whenever you read most of these other ones, Luke kind of pointed out that they're, at least to some degree, kind of patriotic. They're talking about how great Greece is. This is a weird thing, but if you study, especially the kind of Alexander the Great, Philip the Macedon era of Greece, the Greek people liked being Greek. They were very proud of it. They thought, and Alexander the Great specifically, thought Hellenism was a gift to the world. They thought that their rhetoric, their philosophy, their language, they thought all of those things were something that it was their duty to spread Hellenism throughout the world. And that was one of the things that Alexander the Great did. He it was kind of sympathetic toward the places he took over if they agreed to accept the languages and those sort of things. This particular play kind of is from the other perspective, and it's almost designed as, like I said, almost a piece of propaganda to make you feel sorry for the Persians who were defeated. And rather than trying to draw pride for Greece, it was supposed to invoke sympathy toward those people who were defeated. And there's at least some thought in literary analysis and those sort of things that the Persians would have been thought of as barbarians. And to some degree they were. They weren't uneducated, but they really lived and died based upon their military prowess. Greece, on the other hand, lived and died based upon their intelligence. So the play was designed, at least to some degree, to create a degree of empathy toward these people that they probably would have thought as savages. I don't know. What thoughts do you have, Luke?
Yes. I was thinking it's really interesting the way he treats the Persians, because as you did say, he does seem very patriotic in all of his plays. You know, he loves Greece, especially Athens. This was a play for Athenians, and it was supposed to, the plays, in addition to being, I think, poetically beautiful, were also meant to engender some sort of respect for who they were as a people. And in the Persians, I don't think he got rid of that theme at all. It was still there, but I think he was able to put it alongside this sort of maybe a tip of the hat to the Persians for the great empire that they were as well. And I actually have this block of quotes marked out in this particular play that I wanted to read. And this will give people sort of a glimpse of the type of plays they are and what they sort of sound like too. And this is something I wrote this down as being sort of a summary of who the Athenians were. And in this play, in this particular quote, Atossa is the queen of Persia. She's the widow of Darius, the emperor of Persia, who has recently died. And she's the mother of Xerxes, who is the Persian emperor who has just been, beat to death. His army has just been shellacked by the Greeks, and that's the setting for the play. And
one thing that some people this comes up every now and then. The Darius that is mentioned in this play is not the same Darius that we see in the book of Daniel. This would have probably been either his the Darius that is in the lines then, that one would have probably been this gentleman's either great uncle or great uncle, who was a governor rather than an emperor. But anyway, go on.
Yes, because Xerxes, I believe, is the Ahasuerus of Esther. Isn't that right?
It's either. Or
at least that's one of the possibilities.
Or his grandson. There were two.
Oh, okay.
There were two Xerxes. Xerxes, the first and the second. The second is usually the one that's called the Great. So it's difficult to figure out exactly which one it is. But there's at least a reasonable possibility that, yes, this was Esther's husband.
Yeah, okay. And that's interesting too, by the way, if you kind of look at some of these events, and when we get Herodotus, the historian, in these great books, we'll actually see a lot more of him and of this Xerxes that we're reading about in the play, and what happened to him. He's the one that of course tried to conquer the Greeks. He's the one that fought the 300 Spartans, and Leonidas, that sort of thing. And if he is that Ahasuerus of Esther, then the events of Esther probably took place pretty closely after the events of Thermopylae and of fighting the 300 and of being defeated by the Greeks at Salamis. So it's interesting. But okay, so Atossa is the mother of Xerxes, and she has this fear that the Athenians, or that the Greeks, have completely wiped out her son and taken all of his army away. And she's talking to this chorus of Persian elders who are the ministers of state. And in each of these plays you have a chorus, and that seemed to actually be a pretty common thing in these ancient Greek plays, was that you always had a chorus, and it almost seemed like they were sort of the main part of what the play was. It was really the chorus kind of singing a song to you, essentially, or speaking one. But I read in this note, a biographical note, that Aeschylus kind of changed that, and he actually placed the emphasis of his plays on dialogue, and that the chorus had lesser of a role starting with him in Greek plays than previous plays had. And so he's got more dialogue in his plays than some of the older ones did. But anyway, Atossa, the wife of Darius and the mother of Xerxes, is asking this chorus about Athens and about the Athenians. And she said, "Is the great people, can this Athens send against him a numerous armament?" And the chorus says, "We Medes have cause to know their army by its deeds." And she says, "Are they great archers then?" And they say, "Princess, not so. 'Tis not the arrow's point, the sinewy bow, that makes them to be feared. Stand they or charge, they are close fighters with the spear and targe." And of course, we know that from the Iliad, and that's definitely the case. And then Atossa asks, "What more of mark? Have they much wealth laid by?" And they say, "A vein of silver is their treasury." And she says, "Who is the ruler of this people? Who lord of their levies and their revenue?" And they say, "Subject they are not unto any man." They say, "Slave sorts not with Athenian." And so it's really interesting that that's the characterization and summary of who he says the Athenians are, is essentially, and this is the theme I think you also see throughout all of these plays written by Aeschylus, is that the Athenians are a free people. And it's very important to him, and that sort of liberty ideal is a very strong rallying cry in all of these plays. And so, and perhaps anyone listening to this may have been told in school that in large part, the American ideal for freedom and liberty has come down to us from the Greeks. And I think there's some issues with that idea in certain of its applications. But on a basic level, I think it's definitely true, and you can already see it very early in this play of Aeschylus, the idea of the Athenians being a free people. They don't have some overlord who's, sort of in charge of them and is a despot over them, but that they're a free people. It's a very important idea to them. So that's sort of the theme of this, in the play The Persians. You have this empathy for Persia, but you still have this profound respect for Athens, and you sort of have that's one reason I actually like this one, maybe a little bit more than the others. I'm not sure. One of the reasons is because there's a little bit more nobility to this one. and mutual honor between two great empires. One has victory over the other, and yet even in defeat, honor is given to the defeated. So.
Yeah, well, I think it was probably my favorite too. It's maybe because it has more to do with Middle Eastern history than it does Greek history, which I don't know. After the Iliad and the Odyssey together, I was tired of those. So the other one
Oh,
I want
not
to talk
me.
about.
I'm really interested. Yes, go ahead.
As I said, the other one that I want to talk about specifically was Prometheus Bound, which is one of the more well-known, maybe not the most well-known, but I know that the whole idea of being chained to the rocks is something that has come up in, I believe, several different works. I actually know the reason I remember it is there was one set of Magic the Gathering that had a Greek motif, and Chained to the Rocks was one of the cards. So that is what I remember about it. So give us a quick rundown of, we have to understand who the Titans are for this story to make any sense. So can you give us a quick rundown of that? Because you understand that a little bit better than I do.
Okay. So what you have are Prometheus is, well, actually, there's one thing I meant to look up because when I read it, I wasn't exactly sure if Prometheus was one of the Titans. I believe he is. Is that correct? As far as you know?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's one of the Titans.
Then I'm on the right track then. So and I think we mentioned this a little bit in the Iliad or Odyssey, maybe both of those. But what happened? You have the Titans in Greek mythology, and they were the older gods essentially. And I think on a historical basis, you could see that maybe the peoples that made up Greece before Greece was Greece probably worshiped gods which were much closer to nature and in some way mirrored some of the newer Greek gods, but they were a little bit different. And either way, they were older. What happens in the mythology, I think, sort of mirrors what actually happened in history, which was that as different people started to get together and form more advanced civilizations, they started to combine their gods together. And so they sort of had, mutual identities. And in some cases, some gods conquered others in the mythology. And so that's the case with the Titans, is you have Zeus, who's of course the king of the gods, but he is the son of Kronos, and Kronos is a Titan. And as a matter of fact, Kronos has three sons. He has many sons and daughters, but three of them are Zeus, who's the lord of the sky, Poseidon, who's lord of the sea and of the earthquake, and then of Hades, who's lord of the underworld. And so these three brothers sort of have the dominion afterward, and Zeus ends up, long story short, there is a war between the Titans and the gods, and Zeus ends up being victorious in that with the gods, and he binds all of the Titans up and puts them in different prisons. And one of the most famous of those, of course, is Atlas. He was one of the Titans as well. Mm-hmm. And everyone knows, of course, that Atlas is he who holds up the pillar, which he's holding up that. He basically is the pillar which holds up heaven and earth, and he's holding everything up in place. And that's where Zeus put him. And so this play begins where you have Prometheus, who's being led by some of the gods, to his prison. Hephaestus, who we saw from the Iliad, who was one of the sons of Hera, and he's sort of the craftsman god. He knows how to make things. And he is, although it's really against his will, he doesn't really want to do this. He has to chain Prometheus to a rock and keep him there, and that's sort of his prison for years and years, or however long, for millennia, let's say. Anyway, he's stuck there. And interestingly, the thing that he did, the reason why that he is the specific reason why he's being chained to a rock is in one of the first lines here. It says, "For thine own blossom of all forging fire, he stole and gave to mortals." So the thing is, it seems that he's being punished for giving the ability to man to make fire. So that's the basis for the story here.
And it's not explicitly stated, but there's at least a couple times that, in addition to fire, the idea of creativity and the ability to think for themselves is also kind of implied with this. So that
Right, and maybe there's that's the reason Hephaestus is the one who's chaining him up, because of course Hephaestus being sort of the blacksmith of the gods. Now that man has fire, they can sort of be Hephaestus themselves, and so he's the one that's punishing Prometheus for giving him that ability.
So he's being punished because he allowed man to become more like gods. And at least the impression that we get is the gods don't like that. And something,
right.
So generally, in the stories that we've read so far, Zeus is generally looked at as something positive. He's sort of the antagonist in this particular story.
Yes, he is.
And it almost seems like one of the things that upset Zeus was the fact that Prometheus was giving man the ability to do things for themselves. And he wanted them to rely on him rather than be able to do things for themselves, which is kind of this weird jealousy. Never psychoanalyzed the false god before, but anyway.
It's quite fun, let me assure you. This is the ogre aspect of the father, you might say, viewed through your own unrighteousness and your own mistakes. You see sort of, well, I don't know, it's the way a lot of people have perceived Yahweh in the Old Testament, right? You probably heard that idea that, the God of the Old Testament was this, this seemingly harsh God, and the God of the New Testament was all love. And obviously there are some problems with that idea. But on some basic level, it's actually not a bad way to look at God in general. And that would include the idea of Zeus, too, in that he partakes of some sort of divine nature. You understand something about godness or godhood from looking at both angles of who he is. There's his really his freedom to do what he wants. And that's an interesting part to the God as we understand him. But that's even something mentioned in right at the beginning of Prometheus Bound. At one point, Kratos, who is one of those who is enslaving or imprisoning Prometheus, he says, "Why all things are a burden, save to rule over the gods, for none is free but Zeus." And so it's interesting that it seems that every other creature is bound to fate except for he who's above that, which is Zeus in this case. And so the idea for him is that he basically can do what he wants. And the rest of us sort of we have to live with it. That's sort of the theme of this play.
So Prometheus is one of the characters being punished. We're also introduced to, I've always heard it, Io or Io. Tell us a little bit about her.
Io is very interesting. I remember that text you sent me about being turned into a cow, at least, is entertaining. Because basically Io was a Greek woman, a woman from Argos, which is one of the regions in Greece, and she was essentially a lover of Zeus. She says that she was kind of called in her dreams to go out and to become a lover of Zeus, and so she is, as you kind of were introduced to the problem with I guess Zeus's what would you say, chronic unfaithfulness. He always is taking lovers among women, and he's had so many illegitimate children, many of the sons who are the heroes, like Hercules and such as that, who are children of women, mortal women, and also of divine Zeus. And so Zeus takes this lover who is Io, and Hera, the wife of Zeus, is of course jealous over her just as she is over everyone else. And so Hera puts a curse on her and turns Io into a cow. And now, interestingly, I actually made a connection here that I never made before. And when we get to Plato's writings, we'll see this connection made by Socrates, especially in the Apology, the book called the Apology. Socrates says something interesting. Well, first I'll finish the story of Io. She is made into a cow for being for being the lover of Zeus, Hera's husband, and so Hera kind of condemns her to wander the world as a cow. And of course, Zeus gives her a child, though. He actually allows her to birth children, and many of these children, actually many of the Greek heroes, find their descendants, find their ancestry, let's say, from Io. But Hera has a gadfly, as it's called, to torment the cow, and it kind of chases her around the world, keeps her from staying in one place too long. It bites her and annoys her and makes her go on, which happens in the course of the play. She shows up and she talks to Prometheus, and the way that her exit is brought about because the gadfly returns. And now the interesting connection that I'll just mention briefly, because we'll get to it eventually, of course, with Socrates, is that Socrates said that he was the gadfly of Athens, which means he was the person that was there to sort of, and I knew kind of the idea of what he was talking about, even if I didn't know this story before, which was that, he was there to sort of stir things up and cause a little bit of trouble and get people to start thinking, and yet, of course, that's a very annoying thing. And so and of course we can see now where he's getting the image from. It's the gadfly, which sends the Greek cow, let's say, all across the world and keeps her wandering. So Socrates sort of keeps the Athenian mind alive by being the gadfly of Athens. I thought that was a really interesting connection.
I will say, just kind of an interesting aside, so this form of the myth is only one. In some of the forms of the myth, it's actually Zeus that turns Io into the cow to hide her from Hera. Yeah.
I see.
So just kind of an interesting aside that she always ends up as a cow. It's just how she ends up there. All right. So go ahead.
Well, no, yeah, I had this thought. There's something interesting about this play that's mentioned. And one kind of general point too is that it is interesting how we're still almost always talking about the gods. The Greek mind seems completely obsessed with the gods. We saw that in Homer. We see that now even with Aeschylus and with these plays. It's really interesting how steeped in religion the ancient Greek mind was, and that really kind of gives me pause to think about the way our culture is now, and how we're so compartmentalized and we don't seem to combine, the religious side of ourselves with other aspects of our civilization. Like our great plays that are written now are not about God. What's that?
You know whose fault that is? Plato.
What's that? I'm sorry. Say it. Oh.
I said, do you know whose fault that is?
Oh,
Plato's.
You said that's not his fault.
Yes.
Nonsense. No, he talked about the gods all the time.
Anyway.
Yes, I guess we'll get to that argument when we get to that.
Yeah, it is an interesting discussion of not necessarily Plato, but I guess the way that people interpreted Plato in the medieval time period that has led to a lot of the compartmentalization that occurs today. So anyway.
I don't know. I think, well, I guess it's another discussion, but so I'll let it go for now. But besides that, there was something interesting mentioned in Prometheus Bound about Zeus, and the chorus in this particular play says something really interesting to Prometheus. Let's see, I'll just kind of read the quote, even though it's a little bit out of context. The last sentence, or the last part of the sentence, is most important. It says, "Shoot not beyond the mark in succoring man, while thou thyself art comfortless. For I am of good hope that from these bonds escaped, thou shalt one day be mightier than Zeus." That's a really interesting idea, because up till now, we've had Zeus be the omnipotent top dog that nobody could possibly beat. There was this intimation that maybe Poseidon could be a rival to Zeus, but he never would be. So for all intents and purposes, that couldn't happen. But here with Prometheus, the idea seems to be that if he ever gets out of his bonds, that'll essentially be the end of the world. That's sort of their apocalypse, let's say, or their Ragnarok, as the Vikings would call it. And he would be mightier than Zeus and bring about, in some sense, the end of the world as we know it. He'd turn things around. That's a interesting and rather frightening idea.
So one of the more interesting discussions or comments to me in the entire play is a song that's sung by the chorus about the relationship between Io and Zeus. And
Hmm.
I don't have the exact text in front of me, but it's this discussion of how people should not marry people outside of their own class. And
Yes.
it uses Io and Zeus as an example, but it extends the illustration out to include the rich and the poor from different classes and that sort of thing. Um,
Right.
what do you think about Aeschylus's commentary on relationships?
Well, it's interesting you say that because I'm actually looking at it right now. I had a little piece of that blocked
Go,
out, and if you don't mind, I'd
go
like to
ahead and
read
read
it.
it then. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So what happens after Io is done kind of telling her story, and Prometheus and Io kind of talk, and Prometheus gives a little bit of a prophecy about how one of her descendants will be the one which will eventually unleash him, which is an interesting idea too for the Greeks. But anyway, the gadfly comes back and she's like, "Oh, I've got to leave," and so it says she exits raving, and then the chorus kind of joins in and says this: "I hold him wise who first in his own mind this canon fixed and taught it to mankind. True marriage is the union that mates equal with equal, not where wealth emasculates or mighty lineages magnify. Should he who earns his bread look for a bride? Therefore, grave mistress of fate, I pray that I may never live to see the day when Zeus takes me for his bedfellow, or I draw near in love to husband from on high. For I am full of fear when I behold Io, the maid no human love may fold, and her virginity disconsolate, homeless and husbandless by Hera's hate. For me, when love is level, fear is far. May none of all the gods that greater are eye me with his unshunnable regard. For in that warfare victory is hard, and of that plenty cometh emptiness. What should befall me, then, I dare not guess, nor whither I should flee that I might shun the craft and subtlety of Cronus' son." So it's almost like the idea of a god sort of uh, showering his affections upon you. One is it's a matter of fate. It's like there's nothing you could do about it. It's almost like you're pretty much forced to be the lover of this god. I mean, how can you refuse the relationship with the god? And yet it would be your doom. And on a general level, the idea is interesting that true marriage is the union that makes equal with equal. And I think he's right. And I've thought about this idea on a more human level, which is that I've always noticed that people don't really want to be with people that are a lot better than them, as human beings, or a lot more successful than them. Usually this is the case. And when someone in a marriage relationship, especially if say this person starts to become very successful in many different areas in his or her life, the other spouse, if they don't sort of follow with that and are successful as well, they tend to kind of get left behind in that relationship, and they don't actually feel as fulfilled in it. And I always wondered why, because it also shows itself on the just on the level of physical attractiveness. You've probably noticed that, generally speaking, people that are married to each other are of about the same attractiveness physically. Now, every now and then you'll have this really ugly guy that's married to this really pretty girl. Not to mention anyone in particular here present, but anyway, you know how that sometimes happens. But generally speaking,
Isn't that both of us?
I don't know. I'm just kidding. Anyway, it's generally the rule that people of the similar attractiveness will be married to each other. And there have been different studies that aren't necessarily scientific, of course, but I've seen a lot of these studies where women are given, specifically for women, this is interesting. Women are given different pictures of men of all different body types, and they're asked which one would you rather have a long-term relationship with. And usually, I mean, they have everything from the really skinny guy to the average guy to the fat guy to the really muscular guy, like lean muscular to bulky muscle, and just all of it, everything. And the most of the women pick this one, like between 1 to 3 different guys, and they were all pretty average, most of them. And that was the interesting thing. I thought, well, what girl, if she was given the choice, wouldn't pick some guy that looks really superior physically? And I think it lies in the fact that most women are average. The average woman's an average woman, and that she would rather pick an average man. is no wonder, because I think people want to feel as if they can add something to a relationship. And if the person's so much more successful in them in many different ways, let's say, then it's very hard for them to do that. Maybe you've had someone say this to you if they broke up with you, which was that, I'm just not good enough for you. And I've always thought, well, maybe that's just a cop-out. They don't really think that. But I think maybe a lot of people do. That one reason they get out of that. What's that?
I think because you got told that all the time when you were dating.
No, I did not get told that ever. No, I haven't dated very many people, and the one person that I did date who did break up with me did not say that. She basically said I wasn't good enough for her. So at least she was honest with it, and she was right. But anyway, I think that's actually how people feel a lot of times. So I think there's some wisdom in this, that true marriage is the union that makes equal with equal.
I think that there is one of the big differences between the setting when this is written in and the setting that we have now is in that setting, 5% of the world controlled 80% of the wealth. So that one aspect of it definitely is a little bit different, because we have, and at least in this country, not everybody, but a good proportion of the population, I think it's 60%, is middle class, right? And
right.
The difference between person to person is really not that much. Even what we would consider not poverty line, but low income is still not that bad, right?
Yeah, that's true. There's a sort of basic level of living which is kind of puts everyone on some sort of a more equal playing field, I suppose.
Right. So I think to have a comparison that would, make sense, you have to take some level where it's not just more money or something like that, or more success. You have to kind of go with the extremes to really see what he's getting at here. So it would be like, pick somebody. LeBron James marrying somebody who, I don't know if that's the best example because he started as kind of nothing too. But taking somebody like Will Smith, marrying somebody from middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. That's kind of the illustration. The point that he's making is they don't really have any commonality. And I think that is definitely still true, is that if there's no commonality, the relationship won't work. And I think this, of the things that we read that he wrote, this to me was the most interesting thing that he said. Because that was the way that he, and I think it's kind of what, at least part of the play was getting at, kind of if he has an axe to grind, this was it for this particular one, of how unequal relationships don't work unless they find a common ground. Because the relationship, the story is also about the relationship between gods and man. Because Prometheus, he violated the relationship the way that it was supposed to be, and he tried to create one of a more intimate relationship with mankind, and it made everybody else upset because it violated the status quo. I thought that was just an interesting aspect to this, is that I think this entire play is about how different groups of people interact with each other when they're very different.
That has a lot of significance for a Christian, doesn't it? That idea.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's exactly what Christ has done. Is you mentioned that there's a it's interesting to me when you look at Greek mythology that you do have Zeus, the father of all the gods, who always is having these affairs with human women, right? And yet it's always detrimental to the human being to be in love with a god. It always destroys them in some way, and that's interesting that is the case. You could say the Hebrews would have that idea too, because God is holy, right? Holy, which means he's kind of like the glory and holy brightness of the sun. And it's so wonderful and powerful and so different from we are. And if we try to approach it, we'll just melt to pieces. And that's exactly what happens when a mortal tries to meet the immortal. And as a matter of fact, you see even in a sort of tangible example of that in the scriptures. And as a matter of fact, we've seen this in these books as well, especially in Homer's writings, when a lot of times when a mortal meets an immortal, whether a god in Homer's case or an angel, let's say, in the Hebrews case, they completely fall apart. Like Daniel pretty much faints and dies. It's just absolutely insane, the type of reaction when you come up against the spiritual world. There was an old Lutheran theologian that coined the term the numinous, which was that particular phenomenon. And so anyway, that's another example of that problem. But that's the problem that Jesus broached, because like you said, the relationship between two parties which are so different, it can't happen unless they're made, unless they're made similar. There's something has to happen to them to make them one. And that's exactly what Christ did, is he was and is God and man at the same time. And so you've made this actual, literal union between the two. And so you've been able to raise one to the ability to have a relationship with the other. It's really an amazing thing that motif has been there for thousands of years. And now it has even more significance for us today as people with the worldview through Christ.
Are we going to read Anselm?
Anselm? Oh yeah.
Yes.
I think yes, definitely. He is my main man, Anselm of Canterbury.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he had something called the satisfaction theory, and he made kind of along what you're talking. He had these kind of three propositions, and I think it kind of sums up what we've been talking about with this particular story. So his three propositions were: there was the problem of sin that man created.
Right.
So God had the power to fix the problem, but he didn't have the responsibility for it. Man had the problem and had the responsibility, but had no means to actually correct the problem.
Right.
Jesus had to become man so he would have both the ability and the responsibility by being man to fix the problem. And that's sort of how he serves as the bridge between the two, between the spiritual realm and the physical realm, is by being both, he can help both. And
right.
All the idea of him being a mediator and all of those things kind of pour out from that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yes, satisfaction theory. I read it. Interesting. I just read about that last week. I'm glad you mentioned it. Of course, I had it formulated from a different angle a little bit. It was more of the combination of God's justice and his mercy, and being able to satisfy both of those things. And as a matter of fact, that's a good example of the trickle down theory, which we mentioned before, not in economics, of course, but in this case, how a lot of us in the Church of Christ actually talk about that idea, that God's justice had to be satisfied and God's mercy had to be satisfied, and that the only way it could be done was through him, becoming human and living through that, and thereby satisfying the righteousness required by the law and also the mercy required by the character of God. And so that's something I think which was probably first formulated by Anselm. And so that's true. That's a good way to formulate it from a Christian theological standpoint.
He was the first person to phrase it that eloquently. I mean, the idea has existed since Paul, but nobody has said it that quite that easy to understand.
Right.
All right. So I guess what makes we'll phrase it this way: what makes the works of Aeschylus a proponent of some of the great books of the Western world?
Well, again, I didn't even mention this, but on sort of a basic literary level, the level of it being not just a communicator of ideas, which is important enough, but also of one of the oldest plays that we have. These are the types of things that would have been the inspiration for the later playwrights, like like Shakespeare, let's say. I mean, this is where it starts. If you don't have Aeschylus, then you don't have Shakespeare. So this is like Homer is the fundamental story for all the other literary tales that have been written since. These plays are sort of that sort of first, the beginnings of the evolution of the play as we know it today. As a matter of fact,
I was more simple than that. I was going to say this is kind of the birth of entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. It's at least our first recorded intimations of it fully. And Aristotle talks about, in this biographical note at the beginning of this volume, it mentions that Aristotle said something about them. The first thing was that Aeschylus was the first to introduce a second actor. And that's an interesting thing. So it's like maybe before they just had, I guess they didn't bring in any new people once the I guess the cast was first introduced. But the other thing was something I mentioned at the beginning, which was that he diminished the importance of the chorus and assigned the leading part to the dialogue. And that's a really interesting thing about that. So anyway, there are these important landmarks for the world of plays that were, and one of them is Aeschylus, who, by the way, I wanted to mention in a Greek fable attained in apotheosis, because of course, as we've seen already, that the divine inspiration doesn't go to the priests so much in Greece as it does to the poets and to the writers. And so this person, Aeschylus, because of his writing, he was so close to the gods that according to the Greek fable, he actually became divine himself. So I thought that was an interesting thing.
Yep. I have to say I did not find them as enjoyable as the works of Homer, just being transparent. But they definitely are things, and maybe this is the biggest problem, is we are reading these, we're not watching the performed. Not the next set of lessons, but the one following, I had told Luke I had actually seen the Trojan Women, which is one that we'll be doing probably in 4 to 6 weeks from now. I've actually seen it performed, and I can tell you that watching it being performed is a lot more engaging than just reading it, because these things were written to be read aloud. And whenever you're just reading through them the way that we have been, it's not quite as good. I did find a recording of a couple of them where they have found the different parts. And I will tell you, for somebody who is reading these, that might be something worthwhile to do, is if you can find a recording where somebody's actually performing it, or there might even be some of these. Oedipus the King or Oedipus Rex is one of the ones we're doing next time. If you find, that's one that's fairly popular, and I imagine that somebody has probably put that one together before.
Right.
It is a little bit, it helps you wrap your mind around who's speaking and things better, because they actually sound like different voices.
Right. And, it seems that people might have a problem with this because it's poetry. And, people just don't read poetry that much today. And, well, and maybe it's one reason why I ended up liking it a lot better than I thought. I don't have much experience reading plays anyway, and that's why I thought I maybe wouldn't enjoy it. But I've read a lot of poetry, and I really like it. And so reading this has actually been a lot more rewarding than I thought it would be. And so maybe for those that are, engaging with this, and including you, Quentin, reading this might help you maybe gain more appreciation for poetry. This is some of the oldest poetry in the Western world. Or, of course, it might make you sick of it. One can only hope.
The way I read, the different people, the cues and those sort of things that this person said in my mind provide the transition. And there's not really any of that in this, because that's not the way it was written. It was written to be performed. This is, if you were going to hand this out for high school to perform, it's ready. I don't know anybody at high school that's going to perform any of these, but it is ready to be performed.
Right. That's true. Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking as I was reading it, I wish I kind of wish that um I had maybe in my schooling been caused at least to perform parts of these plays before. Of course, some kids in school will learn pieces of Shakespeare and that sort of thing, which is important too, obviously. But I always thought that'd be nice and interesting to memorize some of those passages because some of the writing in this is actually really, really beautiful. The depth of the imagery and the tragedy that Aeschylus is able to bring out. That's one thing too. Is it seems like most of his plays are pretty tragic for the most part.
Yeah.
And he lays that out really well. It's really quite beautifully done. So just even on a simple artistic level, it's a worthwhile read to me. And poetry has to be sort of, you need time with this stuff, That's one reason why I wanted us to do just one playwright per session, because just for my reading of it, because I wanted to be able to read it slowly. Because with poetry, you can't rush it not to appreciate it. You have to sit there and even sort of, if you can, kind of read it out loud to yourself. I usually kind of just mumble it to myself. I'll be in a room by myself and we'll, kind of read it out loud, quietly, of course. But that will help me to appreciate the sound of it. And really, this writer, the translator, he is really good with the alliterations and with rhyming and just how the sound of the words it's like a song. It's like a beautiful noise. So anyway.
Like I said, the ones, not all of these have audio recordings, at least readily available. I'm sure that there probably is somewhere, but the ones that I was able to find where I could listen to somebody, it was at least more entertaining, which is kind of the main point of these, is to, at least in some ways, to be entertaining.
Right. True.
Anything else?
Of course, no, I mean, I'm just going to say, it'll be better when we get to Shakespeare, because we know everyone's done different renditions of that. We won't even have to read it. We can watch them all.
Yeah. Some of them are very poor.
Yeah, that's true. Some of them are. But anyway.
I was going to say, I do plan to read them. There's a few that I have seen performed that I would like to see a better version of them, so I might look into that.
Yeah, but there's always a better version out there. People have done it all over. I haven't seen very many versions of Aeschylus, though. Maybe we can get together sometime and make one.
Yeah. Although I will say, Oedipus there's a few of those that are pretty good. And that's actually a pretty good play, because it's kind of got this plot twist in it that's very interesting, which we'll talk about next time.
Same time, same channel.
All right.
Hey, that's a good way to end.